One of many sewing joys is using up remnant fabrics, and today's project allowed me to use up some leftover linen from a skirt I sewed a couple months ago. I had just enough left over for this Peplum, the Kemper top by Seamwork. This pattern has front and back panels pieced together, a lined yoke, and bias-bound neckline and armholes. This pattern can also be sewn in knit fabric. I made this version in a low stretch mesh and love the result. It's easy, it's scrappy, and we can sew it together from start to finish. Let's get sewing. Here's my front peplum piece, and we're going to sew gathering stitches along the top edge from one side to the other using the longest stitch on your machine. Make sure to leave tails of thread on both sides so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Do this for both front peplum pieces. Now you can pull those basting stitches to slightly gather the top edge. Then place that gathered edge right sides together with the bottom edge of your front piece, making sure that it fits, and pin in place. Repeat to pin your remaining front peplum to your opposite front bodice piece. Now we can sew the peplum to the front bodice piece with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then finish those raw edges. And then press those seam allowances up toward the bodice. Now place those completed side front pieces right sides together with the center front and pin in place on both sides. Now we can sew these together on both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. And then press those seam allowances toward the center. Repeat to attach your back pieces to the center back piece. Once again, sewing those seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finishing the raw edges, and then pressing those seam allowances toward the center back. Gather the top long edge of your back peplum piece in the same way as we gathered the edges for the front peplum pieces. Then we'll place that gathered edge right sides together with the bottom of the back bodice, distributing those gathers evenly and pinning in place. Sew to attach the peplum with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish those raw edges, and press the seam allowance up toward the back bodice. Here is the top center of my front bodice piece. At the bottom of the center point, I'm going to stay stitch on both sides about an inch away from that center point on both sides. Starting an inch away on one side, I'm going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and end an inch away from that center point on the opposite side. This will reinforce this section. Now I'm going to snip into that top edge, snipping into the seam allowance section by 1/2 inch, snipping from the center point toward the stitching line I just created. Now I'll place my front yoke piece right sides together with this top edge and pin in place starting in the middle, then pinning to one corner, and then to the other. That snip that we created at the center of the top front will help us to pivot the fabric to get a nice clean point at the center. Sew from one edge, pivoting at the center, to the opposite edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then press that seam up toward the yoke. Place your remaining yoke piece right sides together with the first yoke and pin the neckline. Sew this neckline seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now snip into this seam allowance. Careful not to clip through the stitching line. Roll up the bodice from the bottom of the peplum until it's in between the two yoke pieces. Then pin the bottom edge of your loose yoke piece to the bottom seam of the existing yoke piece. Then we can take this back to the sewing machine and sew right on top of our original yoke stitches. From one side, pivoting once again at the center front and continuing our stitches to the opposite side. Now we can pull all of that bodice material from in between the yoke pieces and turn the yoke right side out. Then give those yoke seams a good press. So here's the outside of the garment with the front yoke complete, with a nice clean yoke finish and neckline finish on the inside as well. Now to finish the top neck edge of the back bodice piece, I'm going to use 1/2 inch single fold bias tape. I'm going to open out one of the folds of the bias tape and place that opened edge right sides together with the neckline and pin in place, matching the raw edges. And I'm leaving about 1/2 inch of bias tape hanging over the edge on that one side. Once I've pinned to the other side, I'll trim the bias tape off, once again leaving 1/2 inch to hang over the edge. Now I'll sew from one side of the neckline to the other with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing right inside of the existing crease of the bias tape. Now we can make clips into that seam allowance just as we did on the other side, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Then press this bias tape up and over its seam allowance. Sew the bias tape to its seam allowance underneath with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from one side all the way across to the other. Now that it's understitched, fold that binding to the inside along that top main seam, and with the opposite edge of the bias tape still tucked under by 1/4 of an inch, we're going to edge stitch along that bottom fold from one side all the way to the other, stitching that binding in place. Then we can trim off any excess binding on either side. Here is the shoulder seam of my front yoke piece. I'm going to pull the back yoke away from the front yoke, and I'll take the shoulder edge of my back bodice piece and place it right sides together with the outer yoke only, and pin from the shoulder to the outside edge. And I'll do this on both sides. Now on both sides, we'll baste the shoulder from the outside edge to the neckline seam, basting with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, doing this on both sides. Now that those shoulders are basted together, take that inner yoke piece and place the right side of that inner yoke piece onto the wrong side of the back bodice. So technically the outer and inner yoke pieces are right sides together with the back bodice sandwiched in between at the shoulders. Pin in place through all layers. Doing this on both sides. Now we can sew both shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can turn those shoulder seams to the inside. Now we have a nice clean finish to those yokes on the inside, and we can give them a good press. Now with the front and back bodice pieces still right sides together, pin and sew your side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seams toward the back. Now to finish the armhole edges, I'm going to use my 1/2 inch single fold bias tape once again, opening out one of those folds, also folding back the short edge by about 1/4 of an inch. And I'll place that folded back edge right sides together with the underarm seam. Aligning those raw edges, I'll pin in place all the way around the armhole. Once I've pinned the bias tape all the way around and I'm back at the underarm seam, I'll allow the bias tape to overlap the opposite side by about 1/2 of an inch and trim off the excess. And pin in place. And I'll repeat to pin the other side. Now we can sew inside that outer crease of the bias tape all the way around each of the armholes. Clip into those curves to the stitching line all around the armhole for both armholes. And turn and press that bias tape over its seam allowance once again all the way around both armholes. Then we're going to understitch, sewing that bias tape to its seam allowance underneath with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance for both sides. Turn and press those bias bindings to the inside along the main seam. And once again, now with the inner folded edge of the bias tape still tucked under by 1/4 of an inch, we'll edge stitch it in place around both armholes. Now to hem the bottom of the garment, I'm going to fold the bottom raw edge twice. First by 1/2 of an inch to the wrong side, then fold that fold on top of itself by an additional 1/2 of an inch and press in place all the way around the bottom peplum. Now with that hem pressed in place all the way around, I'm going to edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way around the bottom of the garment. And now the Kemper top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.